It's now my pleasure to introduce today's panel. 2 weeks ago, this event did not exist, so we appreciate the leadership from these top executives and the clearing of their extremely busy schedules to join us today. We have representatives from large, medium, and small organizations. Joining us today, we have Mike Rencheck. Mike is the president and CEO of Bruce Power. Mike has served in a number of senior roles over his 35-year career, and prior to joining Bruce Power in 2016, he served as the Deputy Chief Operating Officer for Areva Group, overseeing its extensive global capital portfolio of nuclear and renewable projects. Mike has been recognized by the National Safety Council for his leadership, demonstrating a personal commitment to worker safety and health, and he was designated by the U.S. Department of Energy as a STEM ambassador. In 2020, he was named the CEO of the Year by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce as part of its Business Achievement Awards. He has also demonstrated a commitment to many organizations that make a difference in people's lives, including Habitat for Humanity and the United Way. Mike is a professional engineer and certified senior reactor operator. He currently serves on the board of directors for the Electric Power Institute. Thank you, Mike, for joining us today. Next up, we have Nigel Branker. Nigel is the president of Health and Productivity Solutions and an executive vice president at Lifeworks. In this role, Nigel leads the teams responsible for providing absence and disability management services, workers' compensation and safety group services, and for delivering Lifeworks' internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy solution, Ability CBT. He has helped shape Lifeworks' approach to workplace productivity with his strong focus on employee experience and measurable health outcomes. He leads the firm's efforts to help clients identify and implement solutions to address mental health in the workplace. He is also chair of Lifeworks Inclusion and Diversity Council. And last but not least, we have Chris Inniss joining us. Chris is the CEO of Pathwise Credit Union in Ontario's Durham region. He rose through the ranks in retail and small business commercial banking at a big bank before moving to the credit union system, which was a better values fit for him, he says. Before becoming CEO, his management experience at the director and VP levels focused on member experience, strategy, and sales leadership in a complex, multi-branch, multi-region environment. Through his tenure at Pathwise, he has worked to transform the organization and its culture, including integration of 5 UN Sustainable Development Goals into the value chain at Pathwise. Pathwise aims to make an impact to gender equality, decent work, and economic growth, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, and climate action. So let's begin our conversation. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Todd.
Good to see you, Mike. Mike, I'm going to start off with a question for you. Do you think that CEOs and senior management have a role to play in addressing hate in Canadian society? And if so, how large of a role in your opinion?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. It's great to be here today. This is an important topic for all of us. And certainly it's important for the CEO and senior managers, but also for everybody in the organization. You know, when we look at Bruce Power, we look at ourselves as an entity that can do good things for people. In 2019, we looked at our vision statement and our mission statement and really our people values. And we work to align the company around the values of our folks. Quite frankly, you know, our vision is to power the future. Our mission is to provide safe, clean, reliable, affordable electricity and life-saving medical isotopes to strengthen our communities, protect the environment, and secure tomorrow. And it's that piece, that last piece really builds around the values of our people, which is safety first, performance excellence, and social responsibility. Those things resonate well with our people. And as a result, we take action both internally and externally to make sure we're doing the things we need to be diverse and inclusive, but welcoming to everyone and really build a strong community. I think organizations and companies alike need to start not only looking internally at what they do, but look externally at what they do and how can they contribute to a better society. And I think our employees' efforts in this regard is world class, especially through the pandemic. You know, Fatima talked a lot about impacting people that you don't know. We've been able to save lives around the world through the medical isotopes that we make. We sterilize 40% of the once used medical devices worldwide. with what's produced there. And our people came in and day out to make sure that those isotopes were being produced and sent out. So I think, I think together as an organization, the tone starts at the top, but clearly when all 4,000 of us engage in that, we can do a lot of good. We always talk about it internally. We do one positive thing every day, we can make a difference, no matter whether it's an internal thing or external thing. And I think that really sets the tone for the whole organization. It really sets a good tone in our communities. Thanks, Todd.
For sure. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. Chris, what are your thoughts on that? What do you think the role is of the CEO?
A CEO of any organization really needs to lead by example. When we've been seeing a lot of really horrible things happening right in our backyard, either in Canada, in the U.S. with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, with the residential schools. So it's I think that as a CEO, we need to make the shift from not being racist ourselves to actually actively being anti-racist. And I feel that our organizations owe it to society to not just not participate in those kind of discussions and those kind of things, but to actively change the way that we do business fundamentally to meet the needs of our society. So yeah, I think no more we can say, well, that doesn't happen in Canada, and my organization doesn't do those kind of things. We don't impact that. We all impact it. It's all of our problem. So that's what I see my role and our role as.
That's great, Chris. And if I can just follow up with that, you made the comment about moving to actually being anti-racist. What does that look like practically? Like how do you shift that mindset with yourself and your teams?
Yeah, so a great example of that is, those little comments that you get having a conversation with someone and they say something maybe innocently, maybe not, a little joke here or there. And it's about taking a stand and saying, do you know when you say this, what this actually means? And as a friend or as someone I don't know at all, I really recommend that you don't say things like that, because you don't necessarily know how it's making other people feel. As an organization, we've actually exited customers because of racist remarks, and they're our shareholders as well as a credit union, but we just don't tolerate that kind of thing. So that's what I feel like the difference between not being racist and being anti-racist. Being a white male in Canada, I'm super fortunate to not have experienced that type of racism. So I feel like I owe it to society, and our organization owes it to society to make a difference there.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. And Nigel, kind of the same question to you. What do you think senior leaders, what is their role here?
Well, I think to add to what to Mike and Chris's comments, I mean, I think as senior leaders, our job is to develop strategy to hit the objectives of our organizations. That includes, balancing the long term and the short term, and obviously it differs. Mike's business is different than Lifeworks, which is a global well-being firm. But I do think as a CEO, as a leader, when it comes to inclusion and diversity, there does need to be an executable strategy, both internally within the workplace and externally in how you show up with your clients and your partners and your suppliers. So in addition to role modeling, I do view the role of the CEO to ensure that there is a plan in place if we believe this is important, if as an organization you believe it's important, that we're doing something both internally to make it a more inclusive environment in the workplace, but also in how you show up in the communities that you operate.
For sure. Great. Thanks, Nigel. Okay, we'll move on to our next question. And Chris, I'm going to start with you for this one. And if we can go ahead and advance that slide, Anna, that would be great. So the question here that I'll put to you, Chris, is what went through your mind when this news broke? How did you react as a leader? And what did you do at Pathwise in response to this news?
Yeah, thank you, Todd. Great question. I don't think that I reacted particularly differently to anybody else. Shock, sadness. looking at the picture and even seeing the picture of the family, just unbelievable that someone could be so filled with hate, in our backyard. And, I've lived in London and spent time in London. It just, completely shocked. I thought a lot about, what makes people this way, and what kind of isolation. And again, it's always, they always tend to be white and young and male. What causes this kind of hate, and how are they finding the kind of a sounding board for this kind of hatred? A lot of different things that went through my head. What we did at Pathwise was really continue on the journey of our SDGs. So we were already in the midst of doing inclusivity and unconscious bias training within our organization. We had a really interesting session a couple of months ago where we ended up talking about, this was specifically around Black Canadians, but talking about the coming from slave names, and a lot of people didn't have their original name. And I know that's a big topic with Indigenous reconciliation again. And so I did some reflecting, and my name, I have ancestry in Barbados, is the same as some people who have descended from slavery. So I've kind of got that original, a bit of that's in there. So I'm just really opening up these conversations, having these really uncomfortable conversations, being a place where we realize we're not perfect yet. We try to be really open and inclusive, and we have adopted these SDGs. We're making some real change within our organization, but it's about having the uncomfortable conversations. We've started to post roles in different ways to be more inclusive to people. We're doing some more outreach in community, women in STEM and people of color in STEM. So supporting some of those kind of things. So it was just a continuation of the journey that we were already on.
Great, thank you, Chris. And Mike, I kind of want to ask you this exact same question. When you did see this news happening, how did you react, and what did you do at Bruce Power?
Yeah, this is awful, right? And for us, it's personal. One of our employees' brothers got killed, right? And his family got killed. His family got stolen by someone committing a heinous act. So for us, we had to reach internally and do grief counseling and really have some outreach in terms of support. You can't fathom what would drive a person to take the life of innocent people walking along, right? It's just unfathomable. But we know we have outreach to do here locally within our communities, within communities abroad, and really internally now to support the family and make sure they're able to get through this and as best they can, right? You can never undo the acts. You can never undo the consequences of the acts, right? And you help people to move forward and progress forward. And we do that with, positive thinking about how can we make the world a better place? How can we do better things here from Bruce Power in our communities and all communities? And get back to that's what we always talk about. What's the one positive thing we can do every day to help change people's minds, to help change people's hearts, and really progress forward society.
Mm-hmm. And Mike, because it was so personal for Bruce Power, because of that close connection with one of your employees, if you don't mind explaining a little bit in terms of what did you do for that worker and for his colleagues?
Yeah, clearly we were in touch with the employee. We've offered grief counseling to all of the friends here in the area. We did fly our flags at half-mast here at site in recognition of his family members. But it touches you deeply when that happens. We're also participating and raising funding for the young man that's going to have to go on now and without his parents, right? Without his grandparents, and without a sister. Right? It's really a difficult circumstance, very difficult circumstance.
For sure. And Nigel, with you?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Maybe I'll answer the second part of your question first in terms of as an organization, what did we do? Like Mike, we wanted to offer our counseling support. So we've and they're not a client, but as a as part of extending our services, we offered counseling to all the parents and the teachers at the school of the one survivor. And what we've heard through that is, Muslim people in the London community continue to fear, especially if they wear a hijab. They continue to be very distraught over this. So we did what we can, and I'm really proud of our EAP business on making those services available. If I thought about what went through my mind, I'd say I'm still reflecting. It's very troubling at multiple levels, and I guess I would say that building on Chris's comment, I've also spent time in London. In my case, I immigrated to Canada, and I first moved to London, Ontario, with my family, and so I have my own experiences in London, and I think many of us who are people of color that have lived there would be, I think we would be appalled at what happened, but not 100% surprised that racism lives in pockets, and the high profile events get like this, which are tragic, get the headlines, but in darkness it festers. And I do think part of our role as leaders is to help, if I talk specifically about the Muslim community, is to help that community be supported and be seen. I mean, there was an Angus Reid survey that came out about a week ago. Muslims are the one segment of Canada that Canada feels coldest towards. I mean, they may feel cold towards 8% of Black Canadians, but Canada as a whole feels cold towards 24% of Muslims. As a society, we don't want them as neighbors, and so those are the behaviors those are the sentiments that allow something like this to happen. And as I continue to reflect, I try to talk to a lot of the people on my teams that are Muslim to ask how they're feeling. And a lot of them are, I mean, it's devastating. They see themselves in that family. I've had people tell me that they don't feel as safe, going out for a run, or they're thinking twice. And as a closing comment, that's the hard part about being part of a marginalized group. I mean, the thought experiment for me was, imagine what would happen if a Muslim driver ran over a 3-generational family. They would still have to deal with the backlash of the actions of their community. So it is tough. So I think we all have a role to play to really humanize this, and to look into those dark spaces to see what we can do to shine light and eradicate these feelings of hate.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nigel. If you don't mind me asking a quick follow-up in terms of what you said at first, when something like this happens, obviously the EAP program is something that's in a lot of employers' toolboxes. What do you see? Like, what are people looking for in terms of assistance and help in the wake of an incident like this?
Well, in this case, we were helping mostly parents, so they're horrified about how to have the conversation with their children. They are going through grief counseling of the loss of the families, and their friends and their colleagues that Mike couldn't relate to. I think there's also just the child aspect. This is so hard. Like, how do you explain that to a child? How do you explain that to a teacher that's lost? Like, there's an empty seat in that classroom. So a lot of grief, a lot of anger, a lot of counseling on how to cope and move forward. But it's a tough grieving process.
For sure. All right, Nigel, I'm going to stick with you as we go to the next question. So Anna, you can go ahead and advance that slide. So major events like this are rare, right? They make the news cycle for sure. But what's more common that employers and leaders and the C-suite has to deal with are the day-to-day incidents, right? Like being told, for example, to only use able-bodied or heterosexual images, like stock art images for corporate, brochures or collateral, or perhaps your only Black employee is late to the office because they were pulled over, again by police. So, what's the role of the business leader here on the day-to-day?
I'll kind of give two answers. So I think one is, and I should have covered in my introduction that I'm an actuary by background, so I can't help myself, I think, in terms of sort of very logical math models. So I would say let's think both internally within your workplace and then externally. So internally, I think you're right. I think if you're going to build sustainable change, I think about the mix of, and I do think it's our job as leaders to figure out the mix between what I would consider behavioral changes and driving behavioral change, and structural change. So I'll give you a couple of examples not related to inclusion and diversity and racism. But if you would like people to slow down and not drive, not speed at a school zone because it's dangerous because there are children around, you can have signage and you can educate and you can talk about the fact that there are children crossing. And probably 70% of us will say, totally get it. I'm going to slow down in that school zone. But for the other 30%, you have to put in a speed bump. And the combination of the behavioral change and the structural change is what drives sustainable change. You can educate me on how horrible it would be to fly through the windshield of my car if I'm driving and not wearing my seatbelt. That actually has an impact on me. But so does the annoying ding if I don't put on my seatbelt. So I think it's finding that mix of, and that's where I think awareness and creating safe spaces for employees to express themselves, to empower them, to share ideas. I mean, those are all the things we can do on the behavioral side. On the structural side, I think you need to look at your talent processes, onboarding, promotion, exits. You need to have the data to look at, are certain groups, are men paid more than women? Do we have higher turnover of people of color? If so, does it happen in certain pockets? So I think you have to build your strategy of how you drive sustainable change internally. And then externally, hey, every company is different, but we all have a role. We have a position of privilege as organizations to use that privilege however we can to influence society, to influence change. And that will differ for every organization. It might be in the communities you operate. It might be with your clients. So I think that's very personal. But I'll give a kind of silly, not silly example that has nothing to do with any of us on this panel. But there is a soccer match tomorrow in Germany. Germany is hosting Hungary. And Germany, the organizer of the stadium wanted to light up, it's a game at match, wanted to light up the stadium in the colors of the rainbow flag to show their support for the LGBTQ community. The Football Association in Europe has talked about football not being accessible and they want to be more welcoming. But in this case, they decided to not allow it because they were worried it might be interpreted as a political statement. Germany's opponents, Hungary, had recently passed a law banning any education in schools about homosexuality. So I use that example because, one of my good friends teaches and talks about inclusion and diversity, and probably a good clue or good hint is, if you're trying to make sustainable change, it probably feels squishy and uncomfortable. And it's really going to those squishy spaces to say, how do we use our platforms to make the world a better place?
Great point, Nigel. Chris, let me ask you about that as well. You obviously have, customer-facing employees that may have to deal with the public, may have to deal with incidents that, you can't really necessarily control because they're coming from external forces. So how do you handle day-to-day things at Pathwise?
Yeah, so really it's about living our values. Every company has their values, and whether they follow them or not, some do very well, and some seem to have it on the wall, and that's that. I mentioned already that we have no problem if we have we call our customers members, acting in a way that is not consistent with our values. We have no problem saying, this isn't a good fit for you, and you should probably take your business elsewhere. And I think that that works for any organization of any size to really look at your values and make sure that you are in fact living them. Nigel's story with the soccer stadium reminded me of something very interesting. You see a lot of global companies. You look at their North American Instagram right now, because it's Pride Month, is rainbows. You look at their Middle Eastern Instagram and it is standard logo. You look at their Russian Instagram, it's standard logo. So are those companies really living their values, or is it just taking advantage of whatever situation? Oh yes, we're inclusive and we want your business, unless you don't like that, and then we're not. So for us, we're really making sure to meet people where they are, encourage those uncomfortable and open conversations. But we also want to allow people to the opportunity to get better through it. Either our customers, our employees, we're all going to make mistakes. So I think we have lots of patience for people who are looking to improve and just didn't realize. But that's how we deal with the day-to-day situations.
Sure. And Mike, I'm going to obviously ask you the same question over at Bruce Power. How do you handle these day-to-day incidents?
Yeah, I think what everybody here is talking about is culture. What is the culture of your organization? We find ourselves being in the business that we're in of power generation and isotope production using nuclear, right, splitting atoms. We have to have a very open culture where everything is questioned, everything's put on the table all the time. So we work on that constantly to make sure the culture is healthy. And as I started talking about, our value system really revolves around predominance in our people around social responsibility. So we have a number of venues where disagreements can be vetted or issues can be vetted, both internal systems and also through what we call our code of ethics. And it also holds accountable our suppliers and different contractors that come to our site. We use the same value system or same culture we apply to those individuals that would come and work here day to day. And then we take that with our employees in our organization when we go out and do community work. It's reflection in terms of, how we structure ourselves in a meaningful way to make the journey. And that includes hiring decisions, that includes promotion decisions, that includes determining how we go about setting up our business interfaces with other companies. We encourage our partner companies that deal with us to also participate and be part of the efforts that we have ongoing and also develop their own efforts. But we have to do it through stewardship. We have to do it through leadership, right? You can't tell somebody to be different or change. You can talk to them, you can educate them, you can work with them. You can also influence their decisions for how you act and how you choose to engage with them. But we always try to do it in a positive note. We always try to do it with a positive presentation, a positive perspective, because with that, you can make progress. And by making progress, we'll take that next step on the journey, right, to get to where we all want to be.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Michael. I think when you look at the influence that organizations can have, not just within their own walls, but also when you're talking about dealing with partners and suppliers and customers, you can actually move the needle there as well. So I'm curious in terms of, when you kind of put those policies in place, or when you make a supplier or a partner kind of live your values, do you get pushback from that, or do they generally embrace it because, not to be crass, but because they want the business?
Yeah, no, early on, as an example, we're located in a very rural portion of Ontario. When we first started to do our life extension program, which is massive, it's 22,000 jobs, both direct and indirect throughout Ontario, 3 to 4 billion in GDP for Ontario. So massive effort. We've asked the companies that were going to support us to move into the area here and help rural Ontario. Well, that wasn't necessarily met with open arms, right? There were hundreds of reasons why something couldn't be done at the end of the day, but quite frankly, when they went and did it, it didn't take much, right? You found out that really it is nice here, and you can do a lot, and people are welcoming, and we've seen a whole economic development transition take place here. There's people from all over the world coming here now to rural Ontario. And, it's been a great thing to see the last 5 years. But in holding them accountable means you have to sit down and talk to them. And then also, we put an incentive there saying that we would do business with people who had a presence in the area. And it didn't take much, right, to align their interest and align their actions. And next thing you know, they're working with us on an Indigenous suppliers network and an Indigenous employee programs and hiring, and it just starts to snowball, right? But that's by taking a positive angle and a positive attitude towards what you're doing. And that positivity rubs off on people, and then they get excited about it, and then you're not forcing them to do it. They do it naturally. And we we've seen great progress throughout all the area with this.
Hey, Todd, if I
That's
could
fantastic.
maybe
Thanks,
just,
Mike. Yeah, go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
I was just going to jump in and build on Mike's comment. I mean, the other thing I would say that, organizations showing up, and we're partners with Lifeworks, does a lot of work with Mike's company, with Bruce Power. But I think the other thing that it does, though, is it creates space. Because if I go back to your original question, I mean, we've had examples of a client, and clients are made up of people, and they're not, and everyone has their view. But yeah, to your point, what if a client says, can you remove all images of Black employees from a presentation? Can you remove all images of Indigenous people from a presentation? We don't want to be associated with that. And that's never happened with Mike's organization. But what it does is, knowing where leadership stands, I would feel more empowered to pick up the phone or send an email to Mike and say, hey, we had this incident, can you talk to your person? Because I know we have common values, and it's a lot easier to resolve. I think what's harder is when, and I think Chris made this point, where you're not sure where organizations stand, because I think part of this is that, we need to ensure our people feel supported day to day, and we work with clients, and we work with partners, and we work with suppliers, and we work with colleagues, and we can control a little bit more about the culture internally with colleagues, but it's a little harder externally. So I just think the more that companies, have a position, take a stance, it also makes it easier for all of us to interact and do business together.
Hey Todd, I would add to this conversation. It isn't that hard, right? For example, we do business in the traditional territory of the Saugeen Ojibwa Nation. And when you look around us, we're one of the communities in our area that we work with. And quite frankly, when you look at the history for 50 years here, there really hasn't been much engagement. Well, we changed that. We changed that through positive actions, right? Through positive interfaces, through outreach. And the suppliers, right? Sometimes it's as simple as me picking up the phone and calling another CEO saying, hey, look, this is a really good thing. Can you help? Right? Just asking that, you'd be surprised how willing people are to pitch in, engage, and do things when it's framed in a positive environment, right? It really helps people embrace it and want to do it. And that's the key, right? When people want to do things get done. And when you have that positive work environment, it's energizing for the people. We do many things like that in the company. The pandemic clearly put us in isolation in 2020 a little bit, but we still did outreach and still did a lot of positive things for the communities throughout the pandemic. Things like raising fundraisers, things like vaccination hubs, right? Taking care of people, on and on and on. And we did that as a collective. We didn't do that as an individual. And when we do it together, we're much stronger. And we've done that all throughout Ontario, not only just here in our area. And it's been all the suppliers that have engaged and participated.
Great, thanks, Mike. So if we move to our next question now, so if we forward the slide, Mike, I'm going to direct this at you, and it frankly, it's really building on what you just said, and it's really, if you could walk me through, in your opinion, what's worked really well at Bruce Power to kind of stamp out overt racism, hate speech, like the visible stuff is what we're talking about now.
Yeah, education, and then more education. And clearly the development and acceptance of a strong culture that has an acceptance of diversity. Are we perfect? No, we're people. People aren't perfect. So you have to be willing to accept the fact that people are going to make mistakes. And then when you engage and offer ways to vet that and correct that, you build a stronger culture. We've moved the needle even in terms of hiring. I can remember when we first started this, we had a very hard time hiring Indigenous employees. We've gotten well past that now, right? For 30 years, it was always, we couldn't do this because, or it was hard because. And quite frankly, when we met with the communities, we heard them say this, we heard the community say the same thing. We heard the saying, oh, this is hard, right? It's hard culturally. Well, how do you break that down? Well, it has to start with education and really that openness and willingness and to embrace each other and really take the next space. And then that started with lunch and learns and cultural awareness days and advancing. Like, I think so far this year, our hiring, we've got 48% of all hires are women, 21% are visible minorities, and 8% are Indigenous people. And you don't get there by not working together and not pulling, especially for us. Like we're in a STEM, we're a high STEM field company. So when you look at the engineering enrollment in colleges, it's only about 15 to 20%, right, in that category. So we've got to be able to do better. And we do a lot of outreach. We created something called a Nuclear Innovation Institute, where we're actually working to teach STEM now to children and really get into the schools to further advance math and science. I think this past year, that group was in 185 classrooms, 5,000 kids, teaching science in a fun way, right? In a fun way, so that really the elementary school children, and when you can get them into that vein, it really helps their overall education. Because mathematics, we feel mathematics is so important to people livelihood, especially post-secondary, and when they move out into a career. Right, understanding math and being able to do math is important to advancement, and we want to start at an early age. But anyway, I think so passionately about this is that when we look at these things and we work together on them, we can make a lot of progress. Bruce Power is recognized last year as one of Canada's best diversity employees, best employers for young people, and best employer for large organization. And that isn't done by person, that's done by the people that work here, right? So because they're working together on it, because they're collaborating and they're learning and they're changing and they're working together, it's those types of things that follow. And we're just getting started, right? We're just at the very tip of this and moving the ball forward. I think society can learn a lot from collaboration. And if there's any one thing the pandemic has taught us, is that when we work together on things, we can be successful. And when we don't work together, you can look at the consequences and see how dire they can be. Thanks, Todd.
Great, thanks, Mike. Chris, kind of turning it over to you, what is working at Pathwise, in your opinion? Like, what have you seen done to really stamp out this kind of overt behavior?
Yeah, for us, it's zero tolerance. It's really easy to ignore. Just a little comment here and a little action there, and it goes away very easily. But I know that our employees who have had to, some of them have had to struggle, and some of them have been going their whole lives having these kind of comments. When Nigel was talking about living in London and his experience a few minutes ago, I thought, wow, that's way different than my experience there. So I think that as a leaders, we need to have empathy, and that empathy is having zero tolerance whatsoever for any of those kind of comments. I think Mike was right on the education, but I think it has to go with accountability and holding people accountable for their comments and actions. Might be innocent, might not, but we don't tolerate any bit of it around here.
Sure, Chris, and that kind of shared experience in London is a good point. To ensure that you're not in a bubble and that you understand what your employees are facing that maybe you're not facing, how do you ensure that doesn't get missed by management?
Yeah, I think it's about having some conversations about race if people are comfortable with it. I think that in my experience in having conversations about race, I'm the most uncomfortable person about it, because people of color are often, I guess I don't want to stereotype people of color generally, but a lot of experienced people are very happy to share their experiences, so I can gain a little bit of empathy there. So I think the first step is opening up those little bits of conversations that, you can't go to an employee and say, oh, so tell, I understand you're Black. It's got to come a little bit more naturally than that. But having those open and transparent conversations if people are comfortable is that really good start for people who don't have lived experience to gain a little bit of empathy.
One of the things is also to help folks find a voice, right? So we created an Indigenous employee network to enable them to create a voice once they got comfortable with that, to be able to resonate it. In the early days, I went to many of the meetings. Now they don't need me; they do their own thing, right? So doing that and continuing that, we have women in nuclear. They have a voice, a broad voice, a large voice, and not only within the company but external to the company. I think, one area we need to do better on is people with disabilities. I think that group gets lost. There really isn't a champion for that part of the organization. I think, on our journey, I think that's our next step over the coming years, is to really take a look at people with disabilities and how we can do better in that space.
Great, thanks, Mike. And Nigel, not to, want to get your thoughts on this quickly as well. At Lifeworks, what works?
Yeah, Lifeworks, I mean, as a global well-being organization, I think there's a lot of things we're doing well. I would echo Mike's comments that we're not perfect and there's more to be done, but we certainly believe in if you want to change something, you do need to put energy into it and to measure it. So, the question was about overt racism and hate speech. I mean, maybe I'll pivot slightly and talk about, I think the harder one, and I'll acknowledge Mike's point that a lot of this is about culture. So I'd be remiss to not say we deal with many clients and many organizations, and not all organizations are at the same point in their cultural evolution. And certainly it helps having top of the house leadership support. But I think some of the more covert or microaggressions are more tough. And I do think they take courage from leaders to role model. So I'll give, maybe two quick examples. One is I have a colleague of mine who's a Black employee, and with the murder of George Floyd, he spent a lot of time talking about his own experience, whether it's avoiding certain neighborhoods or being stopped by the police because of the car he drives, et cetera, et cetera. But what we have to realize is he kind of goes through a little bit of trauma each time he tells that story to help us to be more aware, to raise awareness. That awareness needs to translate into action. So if you think about someone who has that experience, a person of color outside of the workplace, it's really hard if they're in the workplace and they're the only person of color on a team to have that voice that Mike talks about. So I do think part of our role as leaders is to create the space, right? To say, hey, I'd be interested in your thought, like keep creating the space, the positive energy, because not everyone's experience is the same. I mean, we're great on gender diversity. We still have work to do. And every now and again, we'll be in talent discussions meetings and we'll catch ourselves and say, we're reviewing a female leader and we might say that she has sharp elbows, but we actually have lots of men that are jerks that we don't accuse of having sharp elbows, right? So you do have to sort of catch yourself and say, okay, and it's an ongoing journey. So yeah, I think the overt stuff is, zero tolerance, and you make that clear. But I think the covert stuff is much more tied to culture, and depending on where you are in your cultural evolution, that may be easy or hard.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nigel. And if we go to the next slide now, Chris, I'm going to put this over to you. We've, for the last 15 minutes or so, we've been talking a lot about this specific thing, which is really what concrete steps can organizations take. So if you had to kind of pick one thing that you could do, or that you would, kind of, if you were talking to another CEO to say, this is the one thing that you really need to focus on, what would you say that would be? What's the concrete difference maker?
Something that has really is working well for us, and we're very early on in the journey, was adopting our sustainable development goals. So we adopted 5 of those goals. So one that I'll highlight particularly would be reduced inequality, that is very pertinent to this topic. So what we're doing with the sustainable development goals, instead of having it tied to our values or we support charities that do this kind of thing, we actually are taking a look at our value chain and seeing top to bottom in everything that we do, what are ways that we can reduce inequality. So is it that we are being systemically prejudiced in the way we're doing loans? One thing that is of interest for particular, not all Islamic people, but some in certain pieces don't. Paying interest is haram, but they can pay fees is fine. So are there different ways that we can, instead of creating a separate product specifically for those people, are there ways that we can add more options into our existing products where people can choose to either pay interest or pay a fee, whatever works better for them? So really looking at the organization top to bottom with these sustainable development goals and changing the way that we do business to meet those goals. And I think the most exciting thing about that is after I'm gone from the organization many years from now, hopefully we've changed the DNA so much that it's very difficult to get it back to an organization that isn't meeting the goals of the world. Yeah, it would be very difficult to undo all that we've done to meet those goals.
Right. Thanks, Chris. And Mike, what would your advice be to another CEO who approached you and said, what's the one thing that we can do to really move the needle here?
I would take a look at the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole. So I think there's 17 of them. So look at your business, where you can impact. Mike's, for example, we don't do a lot with clean water, but I know that nuclear uses a lot of water and cooling. I'm sure they're doing a ton of great environmental stuff for that. So that might be a really good one that fits with their value chain. So change the way that they're doing some things, which I'm sure they have to meet that that sustainable development goal. So with your own business, look at your own value chain, look at those goals, take on a few of them and see if you can make real change that is lasting in your organization.
Great, thanks, Chris. So Mike, over to you at Bruce Power. What would you suggest to other CEOs that they can do?
Yeah, a few things. You got to be involved. So you have to engage, and you have to really spend the time to listen to what your employees and the people are telling you, right? So like I said, we had our discussion today. We actually changed our vision and our mission to be more reflective of the values of our employees. And quite frankly, that whole piece around social responsibility resonates strongly throughout our organization. And it really helps us shape our culture and form our culture. Sure, the short-term goals are always there for things like water sustainability and other things, but it's culture that is lasting. And if you can build a strong culture around some solid fundamentals, it can take you through the highs and it can take you through the lows in terms of how the business works or is operated, or your financial outcomes or any issues you might have. So we always focus on culture. And I would say, what is the culture of your organization, right? How does it plug into what your people really value? And yeah, we have our ESG metrics. We just got rated by Cicero as a medium green organization. We'll be net zero by 2027 as a company, for example. That resonates well with our employees. They value that, right? So it's an easier step to go do something like that because they are aligned with that and want to do it. So we take that out with our communities. We've developed a carbon offset cooperative with all the agricultural farmers in the area, and we're going to help the farmers now participate in it. And we're working with other companies to look at EV chargers in the area, so we can help the tourism industry here for EV tourism. Like, these things build on each other is what I'm suggesting. And it all comes from that kernel, right? What is your culture? Is your culture healthy? And if it is along those lines, people will get excited about doing things that align with their value system. And you can change culture over time by education, by being accountable for performance along those lines. And I always say by being positive, because you can give critical feedback so that people can learn and improve, but when you're negative, it just takes you backwards, right? So we always try to do things with a positive outcome. And you're not always successful, but you try again if you're not. And I think that leads us in a pretty good direction overall as an organization and as a company.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. And Nigel, what's your advice?
Yeah, I actually think it's a tricky question, because again, I think different organizations are at different points in their journey. So I certainly agree with Mike that a lot of it starts with awareness, and whether that's listening to your employees, educating. Then I think it moves more into action, and having just like any other business challenge, having small set of measurable goals that you focus on. I think the challenge in that next phase for some organizations, I would say the advice would be to take the time to, listen, a lot of what we're talking about today and doing impacts societal good. But I think for it to really be sustainable within an organization, it's good to create that linkage to almost the business case, right? If you're in an organization that is largely dominated by female employees, and that you see coming out of COVID, 1 in 4 women are going to leave the workplace, then that's a business rationale to make your workplace to do better at hiring and retaining and being more flexible. Like, I just think things stick more if we're clear on the, how it ties to your organizational purpose, let's say, or your, in the case of a commercial entity, your business plan. So depending on where in your evolution, I do think the stickability will be linked to the more you can make it a business priority versus a societal priority. But I do think obviously doing the right things has a great impact on our communities and on society.
Great, thank you, Nigel. So if we move to the next slide, Chris, I'm going to pose this question to you directly to start with. Not all of the wrongdoing that happens in society or in our workplaces, it doesn't always happen on duty, right? So how would you react if an employee engaged in inappropriate conduct off duty?
So I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit in the answer, but we have a zero tolerance. So it would be all the powers that we have to rectify that situation, but also so work one. Depending on the situation, of course, we would exit the employee or do whatever we would do there, but also use it as an opportunity for education. It really depends on the situation, of course. But yeah, we have zero tolerance for that. Being a financial institution, being a community financial institution, we really have to live our values in all of our lives. Yeah, but not a good long answer, but I think it's pretty easy. We would not tolerate that at all.
No, it's definitely a difficult situation for sure. So if we go to the next question now, so we advance the slide. So Nigel, I'm going to pose this to you. CEOs and senior leaders, as we know, we have a lot of privilege and platform, or you guys certainly do in the roles that you have. So how can you better listen to and amplify the voices of marginalized or people or victims?
Maybe I'll end with the CEOs and senior leader part, and maybe start with just the concept of privilege, because I do love the question and think it's a misunderstood or often misrepresented term. So privilege is just about having some type of power, and then what do you do with it, right? So I love the example. So I'm aware I have male privilege. What that means is that if I want to go for a run at 9:30 at night, I don't have to think twice about my safety. I'll never fully know what it's like to be a woman always looking over her shoulder out late at night, right? So once you're aware of that, like, how can you use that privilege? I have privilege of being non-disabled, and I love the point that Mike made, that I do think that often gets lost from the conversation. So really simple example, not as a leader, as a human being. That means that I can go to a restaurant, right? That means that I can go to a restaurant without asking if they have accessibility or asking about washrooms. I can use my privilege to ask that question. When I make a reservation, I can say, hey, restaurant, do you have accessibility? And by doing that, I'm using my privilege to influence change. And I can choose to not go to that restaurant, for example, if they don't. So I think this concept of privilege is positive once you're aware of it. And how do you, I have heterosexual privilege. I don't have to think twice about saying my girlfriend or my wife or my spouse. I don't have to worry about traveling to certain parts of the country with my partner and booking a hotel room with 2 beds and ensuring that both beds look slept in, right? So I think you need to be aware of your privilege to then start to use it. I totally agree that as leaders, we have privilege as leaders. If I show up on a Zoom call wearing a hoodie now, I'm much less likely than in my 20s and 30s to be accused of being a terrorist, right? And people are a little more educated and also a little more respectful. So I think as leaders, our number one, and it doesn't last forever, in our position of privilege, it's to create the platform, to create the space, to role model the behaviors, to empower your leaders, to drive sustainable change. I think that's what we can do to amplify. And I think a lot of it does start with awareness, but then also, as Mike talked about a couple times, and Chris, shape the culture, empower your leaders. Culture is what people do when no one is looking. So that's what you want to shape. And that's how I think you can use your platform to impact the world we live in. Maybe as a last comment for some of the people listening, we talked about leaders. I'll give you another example. based on the data I've seen, some of you on the call, don't worry, I won't tell your bosses, but a number of you are probably interested or looking to change jobs. Even in something as simple as that, if you're interviewing for a job, you can ask the question of an organization. Tell me about your view, what you've done on inclusion and diversity, and what are your plans? It's a little squishy and it might be uncomfortable, but even just sort of role modeling that and asking the question, you know, serves to amplify voices on the importance of the topic.
Great point. Thank Nigel. Mike, same question to you. How can you use your privilege and platform?
Yeah, you know, leadership is a privilege, and you have to think of it in those ways. And what I always talk to our leaders about, especially as they're going through some of our training courses here, or development classes, is that really leaders are about unlocking the potential of the people that they work with, all the people. And that privilege, right? That true success is when you see the organization and the people accomplish what they're aspiring to accomplish when they're here and then outside of here. And you can have a dramatic impact on those outcomes with your attention, with your development, with your advice, with your work assignments, on and on and on. And I think it's part of the platform that really senior leaders have to keep teaching. Our role in an organization is really to teach these outcomes that we want to attain, and really the chief stewards, right, of the culture of the organization. And when it's sour, you've got to go look at it. And when it's, you know, midway in the journey, you got to go look at it and determine what do you need to do to get to the next step. For us, we define it as excellence at everything that we do, right? So when we're not at the very best, we look at the gaps and we try to take actions collectively to make sure that we're moving to close the gaps so that we get to where we want to be, which is best in class. And it's not just words, right? It's a value. Our people value safety first, performance excellence, and social responsibility. And it's that interlinkage of things that really help drive us forward and really empower you as a senior leader, right? You can only get so far by telling. You can get a lot farther by teaching. And we seek to do that in our leadership development programs at a very, very beginning, all the way up. We take all of our high potentials. You know, right now, I'm in the process of going through all the development plans for all the high potential females, visible minorities, Indigenous candidates that are in our entire organization to make sure their development plans are structured in a manner that will help them develop as a leader, right, within the organization. In fact, at Bruce Power, we just gave $50,000 to the Saugeen Ojibwa Nation for their youth leadership development, because leadership is that important in an organization and in a community. So we can influence through the community, but with better leaders, we can influence in our organization with better leaders.
That's a great initiative. Thanks, Mike. And Chris, same to you. How can you use your platform?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Nigel and Mike said. Another thing that we can do and we've done is we each get to vote with our wallets in the shopping that we do. Buying local and buying things from companies that fit with our values. We've also done that as an organization, so we're part of the Ontario Living Wage Network. And we are a level 3, which means that all of our vendors are also, all of their employees are paid a living wage, because that's an important value to us. Decent work and economic growth is another one of our sustainable development goals. So we only choose to work with vendors who are paying a living wage, and we make sure that we're doing the same. We can also make decisions with the products and services that we offer. Much more likely to do community development, lend to community development projects and things like that. Less likely to do, support a landlord who is, kind of a slumlord kind of situation. We choose not to lend to pornography, gambling, businesses like that. We really promote social investing, so a lot of ESG filters on the funds that we sell to our members, because that's also important to our members, and that's a good value fit. So all of these things that we can do as an organization really amplifies what we feel the needs are in our community.
Great, thank you, Chris. So if we go to the next slide, we've just got a couple of minutes left here for the conversation. Though we are going to be taking some questions from the audience. We've got some coming in. So if you have not submitted a question yet, we encourage you to do so now. Just to kind of wrap up our own discussion, what do you think needs to change at organizations now? So Mike, I'm going to start with you. What do you think that we need to change based on what you've heard today from this panel?
I would suggest as we look at ourselves and we look at our communities, how do we continue to do outreach? How do we continue to do education? How can we bring parties together to really voice their differences and really start working through those differences? And I think here at Bruce Power, we work to do that within our company, within our supply chain partners, and within our communities. Really seek to help develop and strengthen the fabric of society. And I think companies have to take a role on that. Having strong communities means there's stability and safety for everybody, that the opportunities are there for people of all origins to really to advantage their families, right? That's really what they're there for. At the end of the day, we want to prosper. We want to live in peace, and we want to have a good place to live with a sound and secure future. And again, that gets back to our company's vision, what we call securing tomorrow. If we do those things right, then tomorrow is a better place, and it's an easier place to get to for everybody involved.
Great, thanks, Mike. Nigel, what are you taking away from our conversation today?
Well, first, it was a pleasure to be part of the panel, and in the spirit of diversity, it was great to hear the different perspective on what different organizations are doing. To me, the conversation really reminded me of the fact that this is a journey, and and I think that's actually endemic of Canada, and there were we're in different spots in the journey. If I were to close the loop on that with a little framework on that Angus Reid survey that I referenced, what I thought was fascinating is when it came to diversity, it basically said that every Canadian fits into one of four sort of personas or profiles. You're either an advocate of diversity, or you're accepting of diversity, or you're guarded about diversity, or you're a detractor of diversity. You don't believe in it. And the interesting thing was, across Canada, it's pretty much a quarter in each category. It's pretty uniformly distributed. So I guess I'll pick up on Mike's point and say, the real thought for me is how we have to continue to keep focusing on being positive and being vigilant, but it's really about, helping others to move to one level higher, right? Move from guarded to accepted, move from being a detractor to being more guarded. And some of that is through education, and some of that is through policy, and some of that is through partnerships. And there's many tools in the toolkit, but I think it is it took a long time to get to where we are today, and it'll take time for us to continue to evolve. So I do think it's not a short-term fix, and it takes energy, but I think that it's the right thing to do, both societally and as organizations. So I'd say the takeaway is to keep at it.
Great, thanks, Nigel. And Chris, what are you taking away from our chat today?
Maybe quite similar to Mike, but just in different words. I think that empathy is really important. Read a fantastic book, Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. And I think that human nature to group ourselves and have a lot of us versus them, but really the more time you take to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand someone else's situation, we're all people and we're all really trying to do the same stuff. So I think a lot can be learned with empathy, getting to know other groups and working with other groups and making them into us.
Great, thank you, Chris.